Shabbat Shalom. How wonderful to see a full group and to have such celebration. I'm very happy on behalf of the Social Justice Advocacy Committee to welcome again David Lepofsky, our scholar in residence. David's a prominent Canadian lawyer and disability rights advocate, as you may know. Born in 1953, David's been blind since his teenage years. He's played a critical role in advancing the rights of people with disabilities in Canada, notably leading campaigns for the enactment and enforcement of accessibility legislation. He's received numerous awards for his advocacy, including the Order of Canada. His work spans legal reform, public education, and grassroots activism, making significant strides toward a more inclusive society. We look forward to your teachings, David.
Got it.
There's a mic is right here.
Got it. Very good. I'm good. Sit down. By the way, it's 1957. I don't need any more years. Previously on Social Justice Scholar in Residence. Our world is designed and operated on a ridiculous premise. It is designed and operated as if it's only for people with disabilities. Fade into next scene. People with disabilities include everyone in this room. You either have a disability now or are destined to get one later in life. Fade into next scene. Disability advocates are trying to show the way here in Israel and around the world to deal with the recurring barriers that we face. And now, the conclusion. So, you try to get on public transit, or go to shop in a store, or go to a restaurant, or get an education in our schools, or go to court to get justice. And wherever you go, you encounter disability barriers. Some of those barriers are physical barriers, like steps to get into a building is a barrier for people with mobility disabilities, and people with baby strollers, and everybody else who doesn't want to trip. Some of those barriers are information barriers, like a Toronto Transit Commission that didn't want to announce all subway or bus stops till I had to sue them twice. Some of the barriers are communication barriers, like the lack of sign language interpretation available in a hospital emergency room, even though the Supreme Court of Canada ordered that that must be provided under our Charter of Rights a mere quarter of a century ago. Some of the barriers we face are just stupid bureaucratic barriers, but they are pervasive. What do we do about them? Well, the disability community here and in other countries have been on a journey, as have I in my own life, running in parallel. What do we do about them? Go back in time? I guess we have to do a fade dissolve and a little harp music to the 70s, and we had no rights in law to get these barriers removed or prevent creating new ones. But there was kind of a revelational new idea making its way around the disability community here and elsewhere. Up until then, it was thought that the problem we face is our disability. It's my blindness. If I could see, these problems wouldn't exist for me. And yet, the revelational new way of thinking was, wait a minute, the problem isn't my disability. It's the attitudes of people without disabilities towards us. It's the pity, it's the assumptions that we shouldn't be included, not consciously, but omnipresent nevertheless, and so on. And this was transformative, to get up in front of an audience and say, hey, it ain't my blindness. It's the way sighted people see blindness. That's the problem. This was absolutely earth-shattering as a new way of looking at things. And it led to a logical conclusion. If the problem is not biomedically with me, but attitudinally with other people, people who temporarily don't have their disability yet, well, then the solution is we got to educate them. Public education, or that term I can't stand, raising awareness. Let's raise awareness. Let's wheel around the world or do some other publicity stunt because it'll somehow raise awareness, right? Only problem was, and we tried it. Lots of us tried it. The only problem is, a little problem, didn't work. Didn't work. Didn't work for a bunch of reasons, one of which is it's too much to try to educate everybody. And frankly, it's harder to educate adults. That's why we send kids to school. Because there's some hope. But also, even if you give a speech to an audience, and even if everybody likes what you have to say, by the time they get back to their office, it won't necessarily change what they do. Sometimes, but not that often, not often enough. And frankly, there may be nobody in the audience who's in a position of authority, I don't know, with the TTC to say, hey, why don't we call all route stops rather than forcing someone to sue us? So we tried the public education thing, and it didn't work. So then our community in different countries at different times thought something else. There ought to be a law. Well, if we want to change what people do, we want to remove barriers, we want to prevent the creation of new barriers, let's not just try to, try moral suasion. Let's make it illegal to leave these barriers in place. And a number of us fought for those in Canada in the late 70s and the early 80s. At the risk of boring you with law for only a second, if you crack open the statutes of Ontario passed by the Ontario legislature or the statutes of Canada, there are a gazillion statutes. The vast majority of them come from public servants proposing things to their cabinet ministers or political parties putting things in their platforms. But there's this huge exception. Equality for people with disabilities didn't come from the top down. It came from the bottom up. We fought for it. Back in 1980, some guy named Trudeau, no relation to the current guy, proposed a Charter of Rights to be added to our Constitution. That's great. He proposed that it should include an equality provision. That's great too. But it only included equality for some. People with disabilities weren't among them. A number of us fought to get that amended. And the only right, we won by the way, the only right added to the Charter of Rights from 1980 to 82 while it was being battled over in Parliament, the only right that was added was equality for people with disabilities. By the way, most people don't know that. Most people with disabilities don't know that. Most people who teach constitutional law don't know that. So I decided to write a memoir. You can read it. I'm not promoting it for my own financial gain because it's free. Just Google swimming up Niagara Falls. Google swimming up Niagara Falls. You can click and download it. And you'll find out how people with disabilities, even without social media, even without personal computers, managed to battle their way into the Constitution. I was one of many people who took part in that battle. It was quite exciting. Spoiler alert, I didn't have a clue what I was doing, which is something I've tried to maintain throughout my career. We also fought to get into the Human Rights Code. the anti-discrimination law in this province, and we won back in 1982. So here, after some major efforts in different provinces by different people, we got to a point where it was illegal to discriminate based on disability. These laws included a duty to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities. These laws made it illegal to leave these barriers in place or to create new ones. So it should have worked, right? Only one problem. Didn't work. Didn't work. Why not? Were the laws badly written? Nope. Did the courts mess them up and interpret them too narrowly? Nope, quite the opposite. When these did get to court, the courts took disability equality pretty seriously for the most part. There were hiccups. But they interpreted our rights broadly. They interpreted defenses narrowly. It was good stuff. But there were two inherent problems with those laws. The first problem is that they require us as individuals with disabilities to become private accessibility cops, to have to fight every single barrier we face, one organization at a time. Yeah, if people's awareness is raised and they change their practices, that's great, but too often it doesn't happen. So we'd have to fight. And people with disabilities disproportionately live at or below the poverty line, don't have access to legal services, or if they do, they can't afford them. Or if they can, it's not where they want to spend their money. Like eating comes first. So the first problem is we burdened individuals with disabilities to fight these fights. And I know what this is like. I mentioned before that I fought with the TTC. I had to litigate against the TTC for years to force them to announce all subway and bus stops. Like, what could be so difficult? 2 trials, one about subways, one about buses. And the TTC, I revealed how much they paid for lawyers because I did a freedom of information request. They spent almost $500,000 on lawyers opposing consistently calling all bus and subway stops. Next time you hear people say, oh, we'd love to do accessibility, but we just can't afford it. Think about how much money was being spent on fighting us. So that's the first problem with the Charter of Rights and the Human Rights Code, is you got to litigate barriers one at a time, and most people with disabilities can't or won't. The second problem is that if you are an obligated organization, if you are a store or a school or a government office or a Jewish congregation, and you say, I want to do what we need to do. What do we need to do? It's usually good if the law tells you what you need to do. But if you pick up the Charter of Rights, which doesn't apply to private action, or the Human Rights Code, which does, you'll read these grand terms like do not discriminate because of disability, and you hear about accommodating people with disabilities, but they don't tell you exactly what to do. So those organizations who actually want to do the right thing, it makes it the hardest to do it by not assisting by giving clear legal guidance. So this led a number of us, a number of people, first in the States, then in Ontario, in the first half of the 1990s, to say, we need a better law, not to replace the Charter and the Human Rights Code, but one that will get these laws to be implemented without us having to sue one barrier at a time, and a law that will provide to obligated organizations clear guidance on what they got to do and when they got to do it by, so it makes it easier for them to comply. I had the privilege of leading the fight for the enactment of the first of those laws. It's called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. And it was pretty exciting. It was passed in May of 2005. It was passed in the Ontario legislature unanimously. And then the MPPs gave it a standing ovation. They can't agree on what the time of day is. But they agreed on this. It was pretty exciting, and it was a good law. It didn't have everything we wanted, but it was a good law. We worked closely with the government on developing it. But the problem we now, and by the way, other provinces have started following this. Manitoba did in 2013, again after grassroots pressure from their disability community. Nova Scotia, a couple of years after that. BC, a group formed called Barrier Free British Columbia. I had the privilege of being there when they got started. They got a law passed. And even in 2019, our Parliament passed the Accessible Canada Act to cover barriers in the federal jurisdiction. You know, airlines, banks, and stuff like that. The problem now is that both levels of government are doing a very poor job implementing these laws. And I have the privilege of leading the coalition, the AODA Alliance, that's trying to get the Ontario government to do a much better job. If you've seen me in the press, that's usually what I'm talking about. Let me give you just one illustration. School. School is vital for everybody. It is particularly vital for kids with disabilities. If you can't get a good education, you can't get a good job. And the fact is, people with disabilities face horrendous unemployment rates, much higher than the national average. Our late Lieutenant Governor, David Onley, a friend of mine, often said, and I often quoted him saying, that the national unemployment rate facing people with disabilities in Canada is not only a national crisis, it's a national shame. But if you can't get a good education, you can't get a good job. And our school system and our universities and colleges are replete with disability barriers. So what do we do about it? Well, under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the Ontario government has a power and a duty to do something about it. It can develop and enact a regulation called an Education Accessibility Standard that will spell out what colleges, universities, school boards have to do and when to become barrier-free to their students with disabilities. We've been fighting, my coalition has led the fight since 2009 to get an education accessibility standard passed in Ontario. Who could be against it? We still don't have one. We fought and finally got the previous Premier, Kathleen Wynne, back in 2016 to agree that they develop one. The Tories in opposition said, why aren't you moving faster? Until they got in power. Then they figured out how to move slower. The first step is to appoint a government-appointed advisory committee of experts from the disability community and among educators to recommend what should be in the regulation. What are the barriers in the school system? That committee worked for 4 years, came up with a report that was the most comprehensive review of our school system in our lifetimes, showing what the barriers are, why they're wrong, how to fix them, what the regulation should include. I had the privilege of serving on that committee. We rendered our report almost 2.5 years ago, and what has the Ontario government done with it? Absolutely nothing. So what do we do? What do we do? I am an optimist and I'm an activist. So here goes. Number one, I encourage you as individuals and as a community, as a congregation, to include advocating for accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities in our society on your social justice agenda. I am honored that you invited me this year. It shows that you are committed and supportive of that cause. Let's turn it into action. Number one, sign up to get our email updates from my coalition. We will give you action tips on what to do. I know it's Shabbat, so I will send the link after Shabbat, but for those of you who memorize links, because you've got nothing better to do while I'm talking, it's aodaalliance.org. aodaalliance.org. Right on the homepage, you click on something that says, sign up. We are clever. Paste in your email address, and you will get updates from us telling you what's going on, and that virtually always will have a section that says how you can help. We won't be asking for money. We don't do that. We don't have any money. We're totally volunteer driven. But we will give you tips on how to advocate. Now, you could do this as individuals, but also When we call for people to write their member of the legislature and say, we need an education accessibility standard now, your congregation can also do it as a congregation. That would really, really help. The second thing that I encourage you to do, and I've had a wonderful meeting with your Social Action Committee on how to do this, is you have a very welcoming congregation. Come up with a strategy to reduce or eliminate barriers within your own congregation. It's easy to do. Some of them will cost nothing. If they cost more, you figure out how do we amortize it over time. But there are lots you can do. Even beginning by announcing on your website, on your telephone system, on your letterhead, that this congregation is committed to fully including people with disabilities in all aspects of communal life. If you need an accommodation, a disability accommodation, we will do our best to meet your needs. Just let us know. Here's who to call. Just offering a welcoming environment, to seek and receive accommodations for people with disabilities is a real pleasant change for us. And it's really appreciated, even if we don't have to ask for anything. It's just knowing we can and that there is that offer makes a huge difference. And guess what? It doesn't cost anything to do that. But so I've listed for you a couple of ideas. One, individually and collectively having your voice heard in support of our cause. And my coalition will give you the ways to do that. And second, looking within your community, your congregation, to figure out where you could take steps. It would be great if a year from now you could look back and say, here are the 6 barriers we fixed. See what they are, figure out what will work. But there's one more thing before I conclude. And this is going to come back to where I started when I first spoke to you last November. And that is with respect to Israel. I spoke last November about the disproportionate impact that the October 7th crisis and the ensuing war in Gaza has had on people with disabilities within Israel and within Gaza. And it is a complicated, messy situation. I don't need to tell you that. Only since I was last before you, I spent a week in Israel on an amazing Canadian-based tour called Kaleidoscope, where we were looking at all aspects of the consequences of October 7th from every perspective. And I mean every perspective. And no matter how complicated I thought it was before I got on the plane to go there, I didn't have a clue how complicated it was. But on the other hand, what I did come out of it with, and I want to share it with you, is no matter how bad things now look, and whatever be your politics on Israel, things look bad right now, and way worse than a year ago. I came away with a really important message, and it's a message that really is the confluence of what I've learned from that experience and from my disability rights advocacy. It's easy to think we don't have hope. When we were fighting to get disability into the Charter of Rights 4 years ago, it looked kind of uphill. Why else would I name the memoir of the fight Swimming Up Niagara Falls? But we managed it. In fact, every battle in the disability rights environment I've been involved in has looked like swimming up Niagara Falls. And the fights that other colleagues of mine in the disability rights movement, in which I have not had a chance to take part, they look the same. Do we win every one of them? Absolutely not. When I look at the situation in Israel right now, finding a way out of it looks like swimming up Niagara Falls, but I will tell you that I actually have hope, and I have a lot of hope, because there is a path. It is the path of shared society. And if you want to learn more about how that is going to be conducted, or is being conducted, I invite you to connect with the New Israel Fund, with whom I'm extensively involved, and with whom I'll be going to Israel this September again to see what, and meet the frontline social justice advocates. Shared society and what they're working on is the way out of this mess. Is it an uphill battle? Yeah, it's kind of like swimming up Niagara Falls. But the message I really want to conclude with, when people have said to me, I don't have hope. Hope is not something you have. Hope is something you must create. The challenge for us, whether it's in the situation in Israel, for people with disabilities, or for shared society, or whatever the issue is, or humanitarian aid, or enabling people in Israel to be able to go back to their homes, whichever issue you focus on, hope is not something we have. Hope is something we have to proactively create. And similarly, when it comes to equality and inclusion for people with disabilities, believe me, it doesn't get served up. That's why the equality rights we've won in legislation have come so often from us, not from the government handing them to us because somebody in public service decided that would be a good idea. So with that, I conclude by saying you invite a social justice scholar in resident to be part of your congregation, and I think that's unbelievably amazing. And I'm incredibly honored to have had the privilege this past year and to get to know your congregation. And I'm quite happy to explore ideas for, I don't know, social justice scholar in advocacy, the next generation, or Deep Space Nine, or we'll come up with some version. But whatever it may be, your commitment to social justice is inherently an expression that as a community you want to create hope. So I invite you, I encourage you, not to think in terms of whether I have hope, but whether I'm prepared to work to create it. And if we work together, we can. Shabbat Shalom, and again, thank you very much for inviting me to take on this role with you.
What an incredible address, and stirring, and call to action. So Laurel has something for you. David,
And first of all, again, thank you on behalf of what you've done all year. Just to make sure people know, I know you did have an opportunity to meet with our younger congregants in the Hebrew school, in the B'nai Mitzvah class, and they had some good questions.
They were a blast, actually.
Good. So
But nobody had any bow ties. That was the problem.
That's a good start. So we just have a certificate of appreciation for your significant contribution by sharing your invaluable knowledge, wisdom, and expertise as a scholar in residence. Thank you, and you've inspired us. Many of us have signed up for the AODA newsletter. We did take some action following up on some of your suggestions, so we'll keep at it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. You got it?